Okay, so get this. We're diving deep into the Irish general election.
Sounds intense.
It is, it is.
Yeah.
It's just 3 weeks away, and you know what? You sent over some seriously interesting research that I think is going to help us really unpack this thing. This could be a historic moment for Ireland.
It really could. It's a fascinating time in Irish politics, that's for sure. For the past century, it's basically been the same two parties calling the shots, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael.
The centrists.
Right, exactly. But lately, there's been a palpable shift. You can just feel it.
A shift. It feels like a full-blown earthquake to me.
Okay, yeah. Maybe more like an earthquake.
And Sinn Féin, they're right at the epicenter of all this.
They are, and it's been a meteoric rise for them. In the 2020 election, they actually became the second largest party in the parliament. That's huge.
Yeah, it is. And first left-wing party to lead the opposition, right?
Yeah.
I mean, after a century of the same two parties at the top, it's pretty wild.
It's a massive change, a total shakeup of the political landscape.
And they're not stopping there. I mean, from your research, it looks like they're aiming to actually form the government this time.
That's right. Which, if you think about it, just a few years ago, that would have been unthinkable.
Absolutely. But hold on. They did hit a bit of a rough patch this year, didn't they?
Yeah, there were some bumps in the road. Those local and European elections didn't go as well as they'd hoped.
And there were a few controversies too, right, from the sources you sent over. Did those hurt them?
They definitely had an impact. I think it's no coincidence that the Prime Minister, Simon Harris, called this snap election so early.
3 weeks? That's crazy.
Exactly. 3 weeks. He's probably trying to capitalize on Sinn Féin's dip in support.
So it's a gamble, really. Can Sinn Féin pull off a comeback in just 3 weeks? It's a tight race against time, that's for sure.
It is, but we can't talk about this election without talking about, well, the elephant in the room. Housing.
Right. Everyone's talking about it.
Everyone is. It's the dominant issue this election.
And I've got to say, from everything I've read, it sounds really dire.
It is.
Record levels of homelessness, children without homes. It's just heartbreaking.
It's awful. And the sources you picked out, they paint a really grim picture. Rent prices are through the roof. It's part of this much bigger cost of living crisis that's putting so much pressure on people.
That's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Housing costs impact everything else.
Exactly. And the research even mentions that other essential public services like healthcare are struggling too.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm of challenges for sure. So how are the parties dealing with all this?
Well, Sinn Féin's message is pretty clear. They're blaming Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael for the mess, saying that their policies created these crises.
Makes sense.
Right. And they're positioning themselves as the alternative, the party, with a real plan for change.
Meanwhile, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are basically saying, stick with us, don't risk it with them.
Right. They're urging caution. They're basically saying that changing leadership now would be too risky, especially with all the economic uncertainty.
So it's a classic change versus stability kind of election. I love how these classic dilemmas play out in different countries.
It is. And here's where it gets even more interesting. There's another factor emerging in this election, something that hasn't been a big deal in Ireland before.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What is it?
The far right.
Really? That was surprising to read about. I mean, unlike a lot of other places in Europe, Ireland hasn't really had a strong far-right presence, has it?
It hasn't. But in the recent local elections, something happened that was, well, unprecedented.
Okay, tell me more.
A few far-right candidates actually won seats.
Wow. Okay, even if it's a small number, that's a pretty big deal.
It is. It's definitely something worth keeping an eye on,
Yeah.
especially as immigration starts to become a bigger issue in the campaign.
So is this a blip? Or is it a sign of things to come? I guess we'll have to see.
Exactly.
Especially with only 3 weeks left until the election.
I know, right? It's a sprint to the finish line for these parties.
Big time. So the big question is, can Sinn Féin regain that momentum they lost? Do they have enough time?
That's the million-dollar question. Or will Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael hold on to power? It's a real political thriller, unfolding in real time. It really is. To really understand what's at stake, though, we gotta dig deeper into the heart of it all.
Right, like let's unpack this housing crisis a little more.
Okay, yeah, because it's not just about the lack of affordable housing, right? It's about the ripple effect it has on every single aspect of people's lives.
Exactly. I mean, the sources we've looked at, they really highlight the human cost of this crisis. We're talking families being forced apart, young people having to leave the country because they can't afford to live there. It's a lot.
It's a lot. There's a real sense of despair coming through in the research.
And on top of that, the cost of everything else is going up too. It's just a tough time for so many people.
It is. And this is where the political debate gets really heated. Sinn Féin's pointing the finger at Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're saying their policies are the reason for all of this.
It's that classic, you had your chance and look what happened argument.
Exactly. They're highlighting how housing's become unaffordable for so many people.
And what are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael saying? Are they taking responsibility?
Not exactly. They're pushing back, saying, hold on, we're not the bad guys here. We're working on solutions, but these things take time.
So classic political blame game. But it's interesting how it shows the difference in their approaches. Sinn Féin seems to want a much more hands-on approach, right? More government intervention.
You got it. They're proposing things like huge investments in public housing, rent controls, and really cracking down on property speculation.
Big move.
Yeah.
And Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, what's their plan?
Their approach is more market-driven. They want to increase the supply of housing by making it easier to get building permits and offering tax breaks to developers.
Two very different philosophies.
Yeah.
One's government-led, the other's more market-oriented. This debate's happening everywhere.
It is. It's interesting, though, that Sinn Féin's approach seems to be resonating with younger voters, the ones who are really feeling the effects of this crisis.
That makes sense. They're the ones struggling to find places to live, to start families, to build their lives. It's like they're locked out of the housing market.
Exactly, and that's what makes this election so important. It's not just about who's in power. It's about what kind of future Ireland wants to build.
A future with affordable homes, with support for people who need it, with hope.
Exactly. And this is why everyone's watching this election, not just in Ireland, but all over Europe. Can a left-wing party actually break through and make those changes happen?
High stakes. Really high stakes. But we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to unpack.
There is.
What do you say we move on to another big issue weighing on voters' minds? Healthcare.
Let's do it.
I mean, from the sources you sent, the Irish healthcare system, it's under a lot of strain, wouldn't you say?
It is.
Long wait times, hospitals overflowing, not enough doctors and nurses. It just sounds like a system that's struggling to keep up.
That's a pretty accurate picture, yeah. And this is where you see Sinn Féin really going after the current government.
How so?
They're saying that decades of not putting enough money into healthcare by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have led to this. They're saying these essential public services have been neglected.
And now they're at a breaking point.
Basically.
Okay, so that's Sinn Féin's take. What about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? How are they responding to this?
Well, they're not denying the challenges. They're pointing to some recent investments and talking about their plans for reforms.
We're working on it.
Right. They're saying a sudden change in leadership would actually make things worse, destabilize the system even more. They're arguing for a more gradual approach.
While Sinn Féin wants to, rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, exactly. They're calling for a total overhaul.
So again, it comes down to whether voters believe Sinn Féin can deliver on their big promises or if they prefer a slower, more cautious approach.
It does. And again, this isn't unique to Ireland. This is a debate happening in countries all over Europe.
It's a tough balancing act, for sure. Trying to provide quality care while also dealing with budget constraints,
Yeah.
it's never easy. But speaking of balancing acts, there's another big issue on the horizon that we can't ignore.
Climate change.
Exactly. Climate change. This one's gaining traction, especially among younger voters from what we've seen.
Ireland set some big goals for cutting carbon emissions, but figuring out how to actually do that, well, that's where the debate gets going.
And Sinn Féin seems to be taking a bolder approach, wouldn't you say?
They are much bolder. They're pushing for a fast transition to renewable energy. They're willing to accept some short-term economic disruption to make it happen.
So they're really going all in on this.
They're calling it a Green New Deal for Ireland.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, it involves a lot of investment in wind and solar power, making homes more energy efficient, and creating a bunch of new jobs in green energy.
Wow. Okay. Sounds pretty ambitious. So I'm guessing Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are taking a different approach.
They are. They agree that climate change is urgent, but their approach is more, let's say, cautious. They're saying they need to balance environmental goals with economic growth.
So they're worried that going too fast with renewable energy could hurt the economy.
Exactly.
So it's that classic dilemma again. How do you deal with climate change without tanking the economy?
Huh.
How do you make progress without causing too much disruption?
Right. Sinn Féin saying this is an investment in the future, it's necessary to protect the environment, and it'll create jobs. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are saying slow and steady wins the race.
Two very different approaches, for sure. It's fascinating. But, there's another element to this election we need to talk about, something that adds a whole new layer of complexity.
You mean the far right?
Yes, exactly. We touched on it earlier. This is definitely something people are watching closely all across Europe.
It is. Especially because, Ireland hasn't historically had a strong far-right presence, but that seems to be changing.
You're right. The fact that a few of these fringe far-right candidates won seats in the local elections,
Yeah?
it's a big deal.
It is. And it's definitely worth paying attention to, especially as immigration becomes more and more of a talking point in the campaign.
Makes you wonder, right? Is this a one-off thing, or is it the beginning of a bigger trend?
I don't know. It's a question a lot of people are asking.
And we only have 3 weeks to find out.
3 weeks. Crazy, right?
This is all happening so fast. It's a real political nail-biter.
It is. But before we get too caught up in who's going to win, I think it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Okay, yeah, zoom out a little.
Because what's happening in Ireland right now, it's actually part of a much bigger story, something that's happening all over Europe.
You're talking about that rise in populism and nationalism we've been seeing.
Exactly. I mean, for decades, Ireland's been this bastion of centrism. But is that about to change? Is this election a sign that Ireland is catching the same political wave that's been sweeping through Europe?
It's a big question, and to even start to answer it, I think we need to dive into the specifics, like what are each of these parties actually proposing to do?
Okay, let's do it.
So starting with Sinn Féin, what are their big ideas for tackling the challenges Ireland's facing?
Well, as we said, they're campaigning on a platform of radical change. They want to completely break from the policies of the past and create a fairer society.
So they're appealing to voters who want a real shakeup.
Absolutely. Their main proposals include massive investment in public housing, rent controls, increasing social welfare spending, and going green really fast. Oh, and they also want a united Ireland, but they're being careful not to make that the main issue of the campaign.
A lot to take in, a very ambitious agenda for sure.
It is.
And what about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? What's their pitch to voters?
They're focusing on experience, stability, and economic growth. They're the safe choice, the steady hand in uncertain times.
So they're hoping voters will choose the familiar, the known quantity.
Right. They're pointing to all the progress Ireland's made economically and saying that changing leadership now could risk all that.
They're also emphasizing their fiscal responsibility, right?
Absolutely. They're basically saying that Sinn Féin's plans would lead to a mountain of debt.
It's the classic choice, isn't it? The party of change versus the party of stability. It seems like voters everywhere are facing this dilemma.
It does. It does. And this one, in Ireland, it could have big consequences, not just for Ireland, but for all of Europe.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why should people outside of Ireland care about this election? What are the implications?
Well, first off, Ireland's part of the European Union, right? What happens there politically has an impact on the whole EU.
Right, it's not an island, politically speaking.
Exactly. And if Sinn Féin wins, it could shift the balance of power in the EU, especially on issues like economic policy and social welfare.
Because Sinn Féin's been critical of some of those EU austerity measures.
They have. And they're much more supportive of social spending programs.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Well, they've also been very vocal about wanting a united Ireland, which could definitely have implications for the relationship between Ireland and the UK, especially after Brexit.
So there are a lot of potential ripple effects depending on who wins this election.
Definitely.
But what about for Ireland itself? What are the stakes for the people living there?
Well, as we've talked about, Ireland's facing some pretty big challenges, right? The housing crisis, the problems with healthcare, the urgent need to do something about climate change, and now this new dynamic with the far right emerging. The decisions voters make in this election are going to have a huge impact on how those challenges are dealt with.
It's a pivotal moment for sure. It really shows how much elections matter, not just for who's in charge, but for what direction the country takes and how it affects people's lives.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that democracy is a pretty precious thing. It's something we need to protect and cherish.
Couldn't agree more. Well said. Okay, I think we've covered a lot here, but there's one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up.
What's that?
This whole coalition government thing.
Ah, yes, the coalition conundrum. It's a real possibility, isn't it? I mean, the political landscape's so fragmented right now, it's entirely possible that no one party's going to win a majority.
So we could be looking at weeks, maybe even months, of negotiations to form a government.
Oh, absolutely. And that just throws another wrench into things, doesn't it?
Totally, because whatever policies actually get implemented are going to depend on whatever compromises the coalition partners have to make.
Exactly. And those compromises can lead to some pretty unexpected outcomes. So even after all the votes are counted, the real drama might just be beginning.
It's like a never-ending political thriller. I love it. I think we've given our listeners a good overview of what's going on here, what the big issues are, who the main players are.
I think so too. We've explored the historical context, the current challenges, the different visions for the future, and even talked about how this election could have implications beyond Ireland.
And, as always, we've tried to do it without getting bogged down in all the jargon and political bickering.
Right. We want to give our listeners the information they need to form their own opinions.
Exactly. And to appreciate the complexity and the drama of it all, because politics isn't just about abstract ideas or who's in power. It's about real people, real lives, and the choices we make together that shape our future.
Perfectly said.
So I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Sounds good. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder. What does the future hold for Ireland? Will it remain a symbol of stability in an increasingly chaotic world? Or will it choose a more radical path, driven by the need for change?
Only the Irish people can answer that question. But whatever happens, this election is a reminder that democracy is a living, breathing thing. It's always changing. And the decisions we make today, they have the power to shape the world we live in tomorrow.
So true. So to all our listeners out there, stay engaged, stay informed, and most importantly, stay curious. The future is in our hands.
It is. It's funny, right? We're talking about all these heavy topics like the housing crisis, the future of Europe.
Yeah.
But there's something about this whole election that just feels exciting.
I know what you mean. There's a real buzz, like the whole country's holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next.
Totally. And it's even in the research you sent over, there was this one quote from a local newspaper that called this election a crossroads moment for Ireland.
I love that, a crossroads moment.
Yeah.
It really feels that way, like these next 3 weeks are going to determine what direction Ireland goes in for years to come.
I think so too. And what's really fascinating is how this election is captivating everyone.
Right. It's not just the usual political junkies.
Exactly. It's like it's awakened this sense of, I don't know, civic duty in people.
It's like people are realizing, hey, my voice actually matters here.
Right. And it's not just about all those big policy debates either. There's this very human element to it, this feeling of, I don't know, like a shared destiny.
Yeah, I see that.
Like in one of the articles, there's this story about these neighbors, and they all have totally different political views, but they're all coming together to get people registered to vote.
Oh, that's so cool.
It is. It shows that even when we disagree on things, we're still all in this together.
And that's a good reminder, especially now, with all the division in the world. It's good to see people coming together. Okay, so I want to talk about the parties for a minute.
Okay.
We've talked about their platforms and all that, but what about the people leading them? The actual personalities?
Oh, yeah, because at the end of the day, politics is about people, isn't it?
It is. And those leaders, they play a huge role in connecting with voters, getting them excited, getting them to actually go out and vote.
Totally. They shape the whole narrative of the election.
So let's start with Sinn Féin, their leader, Mary Lou McDonald. What's her vibe in this election? What's the image she's trying to project?
Well, from what I've read, it seems like she's trying to do two things at once.
Okay, how so?
She wants to come across as competent, like she has the experience to lead, but she also wants to maintain that image of being a fresh face, someone who represents change.
Experience and change? That's a tough combo to pull off.
It is, but she seems to be doing it well. She talks a lot about her time in Parliament, her understanding of policy, and her ability to actually lead a government. But she also taps into that desire for something new that's out there, that yearning for a different kind of politics.
And how is it working? Are people buying it?
It seems to be working, yeah. Especially with younger voters, they seem to really connect with her.
What is it about her?
I think there's this sense that she's genuine, authentic. It comes through in her speeches and how she talks in interviews.
I've heard people say she's charismatic, that she can really connect with people on a personal level.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so important, especially now when people don't really trust politicians.
Yeah, it's a valuable quality for sure. Okay, so we've got Marilyn McDonald, the experience and change candidate.
Mm-hmm.
What about the leaders of the more traditional parties? Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, what are they putting out there?
Well, unsurprisingly, they're really leaning into their experience, their track record, and their promise of stability. They're the safe bet, the steady hand in these crazy times.
So they're hoping voters will stick with what they know, what feels safe, especially with everything else going on in the world.
Right. They're talking a lot about what they've achieved in government, how well Ireland's doing economically, and warning people that changing things up now could ruin all that.
Classic incumbent strategy. Don't rock the boat.
Exactly. And sometimes it works, especially when the economy feels shaky.
True, true. Okay, but we can't forget that there are more people in this race than just the big three.
Oh, yeah.
There are all those smaller parties and independent candidates.
Absolutely. And they add a whole other layer of complexity to all of this.
Right. I mean, what if no one wins a majority?
Exactly. Those smaller parties could suddenly have a lot of power.
They could end up being the kingmakers. Right. Calling the shots in a coalition government.
Totally.
Yeah.
They could get the bigger parties to agree to all sorts of things in exchange for their support.
So they're like wild cards, shaking things up, making it impossible to predict what'll happen.
I know, right? It makes the whole thing even more exciting. Okay, so we've talked about the parties, the leaders, the big issues, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the voters, doesn't it?
The people of Ireland. Exactly.
Right, because they're the ones who are going to decide what happens next. And their decisions, they're based on all sorts of things, personal experiences, how they're feeling about the economy, their values, what they hope for the future.
So what are people worried about? What are they hoping for?
Well, like we talked about, the housing crisis is a huge concern for pretty much everyone. Rent's too high, there's not enough affordable housing, more and more families are ending up homeless. It's a big deal.
It's got to be stressful.
It is. And it's not just about having a roof over your head. It's about feeling secure, feeling like you have a future. People are worried about their kids. Can they afford to live in Ireland? Will they ever be able to buy a house?
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety. Okay, so housing's top of mind. What else? What else are voters thinking about?
Healthcare is another big one. Long waits to see a doctor, hospitals packed to the brim, not enough nurses. It just seems like the system can't keep up.
It sounds rough.
It is. And people are frustrated. They're worried about their health, their family's health.
Can they even get the care they need when they need it?
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got the rising cost of living. Everything's more expensive. Food, bills, childcare.
People feeling squeezed.
They are. And they're looking to these parties, to these leaders for answers.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's worth asking, what's the choice in front of Irish voters?
It's a big one, right? It's about continuity versus change, experience versus a fresh start, playing it safe versus taking a risk.
And there's no easy answer. Each path has its pros and cons.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole election so fascinating. This is a real crossroads moment. What happens in these next 3 weeks? It's going to have a big impact on Ireland for a long, long time.
We've covered a lot, haven't we? The parties, the leaders, the issues, the whole coalition thing. But you know what really gets me?
What's that?
It's how this election has become this, huge spectacle. Like a political drama, but it's real life.
I know, right? Even in all the research you sent, there are all these stories about people who never cared about politics before, and now they're totally hooked. They're watching the news, arguing with their families, even going to rallies. It's crazy.
It's like this whole thing has woken everyone up. Like there's this feeling in the air, this need for change, and it's contagious.
Totally. I remember this one quote. It was from a young voter, and they said, "I never thought I'd be excited about politics, but this is different. It actually feels like our future is on the line."
Wow. That's powerful.
It is. And I think it speaks to this bigger thing that's happening all over the world. People are tired of the way things are. They're looking for something new, something real, something better.
And all that's playing out in Ireland right now.
Big time. And it's interesting how this desire for change, it's different depending on who you're talking to. Like the younger generation, they seem to be really into Sinn Féin's message, that whole radical transformation thing.
Well, yeah, they're the ones dealing with the housing crisis, the tough job market, climate change. They want to see big changes, and they want them now.
Exactly. There was this article that talked about this generational divide. Like older voters, they've seen more stability, more progress, so they're a bit more hesitant to change things too drastically. They're more drawn to experience continuity, which is where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael come in.
Right, right. So it's all these different perspectives, different worries, different values, all coming together. It's a lot.
It is. It makes it almost impossible to say who's going to win. The polls are close. It's really anyone's game.
It all comes down to these last few days, these final rallies, those conversations people have on their doorsteps. Every vote counts.
For sure. It's fascinating to see how each party is trying to win people over. They're crafting these messages, trying to tap into what people are feeling, hoping to convince them they have the best plan for the future.
But it's bigger than just the politics, isn't it?
What do you mean?
It's about democracy itself, this basic human need for something better.
Oh, absolutely. I remember reading this quote. It was from a community organizer, and they said, "This election, it's not just about policies and parties. It's about who we are as a nation, what we believe in, what we want for our kids."
Exactly. It's a reminder that democracy isn't just about voting every few years. It's about being involved, speaking up, holding our leaders accountable. It's about working together to make things better, to create a fairer world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And it reminds us that the future isn't set in stone. We have the power to change things.
Right. With the choices we make, the actions we take.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Irish election, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. Whoever wins, the real test is what happens next. Can they bring people together? Can they find common ground? Can they actually solve these problems?
Big questions. It's about remembering that even when we disagree, we're all connected. We all share this future. And what we do now, it's not just for us, it's for the generations that come after us.
Well said. And that's it for this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore another fascinating topic. Until then, keep those questions coming, stay curious, and thanks for listening.